biggest problem with the African policing and the human rights being actually the colonial roots of the police groupings in the continent. Police groupings that still operate as police forces, not police services. They still derive their policing systems, structures, and modes from the colonial modes of policing that were geared towards domination, control, suppression, and repression of populations. It's true, therefore, that human rights in Africa continue to suffer as militaries and policing groups continue to operate as forces and not as services. More importantly, as colleagues have been expressing, if we look at the insurgencies, coups that are coming up, terrorist groups that are increasing their operations, and even fighting for the hearts and minds of populations, as my colleague has just said. The problem is that incumbent regimes in Africa, that means ruling parties, some of them that are actually liberation movements or former liberation movements, also practice state terrorisms, state violences, state repressions, and state attacks on human rights of populations, which then opens up the African continent to such fragilities and vulnerabilities as extra-state groupings also coming in with their insurgencies, their own terrorisms, and their own violences, which further deepens the problem of fragility, the problem of vulnerability, and the problem of risk and insecurity in the African continent. So there's a lot of homework that has to be done amongst and within the states in Africa before we talk about countering terrorists, countering the coups, and countering other extra state insurgencies that arise to cause risk and insecurity in Africa. So there's a lot of work internally and externally that has to be done to secure the African continent and the African populations from the risk of violence and the danger to human rights that we're witnessing.
Well, Professor Mofokeng, there seems to be a consensus, at least amongst the three panelists here today, that the COVID-19 pandemic had enhanced insecurity across the continent, and not just that, it appears that governments took advantage of the pandemic to not only to abuse human rights of their citizens, but non-state actors as well have also taken advantage of the situation to create a greater measure of insecurity in individual states and across the continent. Now, do you think that there were security shortfalls during this period? And if you think so, what were those shortfalls?
Thank you very much, honorable member. So, yes, there's so much consensus amongst colleagues here, what Dr. Mpofu as well as Lojo has alluded in terms of what happened actually in terms of the abuse of human rights. I need to indicate that before I can answer your question, that while some human rights may be limited for a legitimate purpose, such as protecting public health, human rights-based approach mandates, that restrictions must be always lawful. That is very much important, must be necessary, proportionate, and evidence-based, time-limited, and importantly, that they do not discriminate either in policy or implementation. Now, in contexts that are constantly changing, policies must also change. It's very much important that we have a living policies in Africa. As new evidence arises or human rights impacts are uncovered, So restriction, we are aware that had disproportionate impact or marginalize or stigmatize certain populations or communities. And this restriction are enforced in ways that magnify stigma and discrimination. While there are many good practices that give rise for hope, other findings, are deeply concerning, as my two colleagues have alluded. As we see that many governments at the national and subnational levels are taking action to affirm human rights protection in communities. For example, some governments are extending access, to those that are affected, such as water, providing social protection, adapting to health service delivery, and providing emergency and such as food supplies, instructing police to hand out masks and supporting community health workers to reach those likely to be left out. So then coming to your question, we need to be able to realize that commentators argue that too often conflict resolution is used as a cover-all term that fails to face up the different processes involved in the reduction or elimination of violence. Now, this statement seems to be very evident of the African conflict situation, especially when scholars and practitioners alike refer to a handling of conflict in Africa, as my colleagues have already alluded. It is therefore necessary to explore, once we are dealing with these issues that are raised today, of conflict resolution and conflict management in order to better understand and assess the motivations and actions of intervening agencies or actors across the continent of Africa. The first major difference between the two approaches concerns the desire or not to raise the fundamental by the parties to a conflict. Since now and then, which COVID-19 has made many things from bad to worse, and we often told that perhaps then we need to rebrand Africa and stop talking about the negative things that are happening across Africa. But as long as then there is an abuse of human rights, as well as taking advantage, because of COVID-19, then we are compelled to be able to keep on talking about issues that needs, alignment in line with human rights culture, as well as a transparent, processes. Now, proponents of the management approach, on the other hand, hence we keep on having conflicts after conflicts. Now, believe that attempts to resolve conflicts are unrealistic. So rather than dealing with basic issues, attention should be concentrated on, addressing, the symptoms of the conflict, and in this way reducing suffering. Perhaps then these are the things that across Africa, as those that are, busy within academia, scholars and policymakers, they provided the resolution approach and argue that the unsolvable nature of particular conflict is more apparent than real. And we have been experiencing conflict and insurgents in Africa for this is the question that, are we addressing the symptoms or we are addressing the core issues, that are confronting this beautiful continent. Then the conflict resolution community seems to pursue resolution efforts in Africa from a variety, therefore, of purposes and interests, and with policies that are often replete with ambiguous and contradictions. And so then it is for this reason, then, as my colleagues have alluded, that perhaps then we have to look at the core issues, and we also realize that as much as there are very competent facilitators from the international community, with good intentions that are within our continent. Dr. Mpofu, mentioned the issue of colonialism, that certain things were forced down the throats, and then we see the same people, no matter how good they are, also spearheading a lot of initiatives in Africa to resolve, insurgents and a lot of issues. And we make we are following that on certain narratives that people will make to say that leave Africa to fix its own problems. And the question I wish to leave with my fellow panelists as well as those that are on this platform is, indeed, we need to be able to fix our own problems. The question is, do we have that particular capacity, or can we agree then as nations and able to consider certain bodies such as African Union as well as SADC to have muscles to be able to bring all nations or continents or regions in the continent to be able to work together? So then in that way, then we'll be able to agree on certain concepts rather than, currently we disagree, as I indicated, that we talk about conflict management and resolution, of which then they are totally two opposites. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Olojo, that brings us to you now. A very big question here. Does Africa have the capacity to resolve its own conflicts, to resolve its own crisis, or does it require the intervention of the international community? And if it does, is the international community doing enough as it is today to do that? In addition to that, since we seem to have realized that there are gaps, there are response shortfalls from 2020, from the last 1 year of COVID until now, do you also think that there perhaps may be policy gaps at national, regional, and continental level that needs to be addressed?
Thank you very much. It's a very critical question, especially at this point. And I absolutely agree with Professor Mofo Keng when he mentions two issues about ownership in terms of how to address the challenges facing African countries, and also the question of consensus among these countries, which in a sense is also linked to whether or not African countries have the capability. And I think we do. I think the potential is very, very high, but sometimes it's also about the sense of urgency that leadership on the continent attaches to addressing these problems, the sense of urgency as well as the political will. And when we say political will, it almost sounds like an abstract concept, but then it is really concrete because we see it manifest in the policy gaps. So now that takes me to your question. When we speak about policy gaps, there are two things that come to mind. One is, of course, in the context of countering threats posed by violent extremism, for instance, there are gaps in terms of how states always seem to adopt a militarized approach or a military-focused approach. There is this prevailing tendency, almost like a knee-jerk response, that before, while addressing this crisis, we always go, the militarized way. Now, there is a role for the use of force. Of course, there is a utility there, but then we do it to the neglect of other important components that should be part of a comprehensive strategy. So, for instance, we neglect issues relating to development. And panelists, of course, have mentioned this in many ways. According to a World Bank report recently, 87% of Nigeria's poor actually live in northern Nigeria. And for those who may not be confident about the World Bank report, they can also take a look even at the national level, the Nigerian National Bureau of Statistics, which actually highlights that 7 out of 10 states in the country with the highest unemployment rates and underemployment rates are also located in northern Nigeria. And what does this mean? It means that there are long-standing challenges of development, neglecting development in that part of the country that are begging for attention. And it's little wonder why we are witnessing some of the, the kind of insurgency or crisis linked to Boko Haram and its faction there. Now, we also go with the military approach to the neglect of issues regarding justice and human rights. Many of us will recall that if we think back